In recent years, Australia has really picked up its game when it comes to the construction of new urban railways, with projects like the Sydney Metro, Melbourne's Metro Tunnel and Brisbane's Cross River Rail. And while this has been great to see, there is another type of railway that, for the longest time, seems to have been ignored, if not outright neglected. That being our intercity railways. Now, compared to our longer distance regional railways, those being routes like the ones from Sydney to Brisbane or from Perth to Kalgoorlie, which are genuinely not particularly good, our shorter distance intercity trains can sometimes be pretty decent. The Sydney to Wollongong intercity train, for example, runs at least every hour, and does so at a speed that is often quicker than driving. And because of this, it's become pretty popular, to the point where overcrowding occasionally becomes an issue. The intercity V-Line train from Melbourne to Geelong runs even more frequently than that, with a daytime service frequency of once every 20 minutes, and speeds that are also very competitive with driving, and it too has seen its popularity surge. So it is a bit surprising that, despite the relative success of at least some of our intercity trains, when it comes to investment and the construction of new lines, there's really not all that much to talk about. But it looks like that could be about to change. Between the federal government and the Queensland state government, $5.5 billion has now been committed to the construction of a new railway line to the Sunshine Coast in time for the 2032 Brisbane Summer Olympics. The Sunshine Coast has a population of around 400,000 people, making it by far Australia's largest urban area without a rail line. And its population is only expected to get bigger, with the population forecasted to reach 600,000 by the year 2046. That's not far off where the Gold Coast is now, and they already have an intercity heavy rail connection, as well as a small but growing light rail system. The Sunshine Coast is also a very popular holiday destination, with 4.2 million visitors recorded in the year up to September 2023. But for these visitors to get there, they're stuck travelling either by car, bus or aeroplane. So this is where the new train line comes in. It will give the Sunshine Coast a direct rail connection with the state's capital, Brisbane, as well as the rest of Queensland's rail network. It could even make trips from Brisbane Airport, which is much better served than the Sunshine Coast's own small airport, as well as other major regional centres like the Gold Coast, easier, with passengers just needing to make one change in Brisbane to access the Sunshine Coast. Now, at this point it is worth noting that Queensland already has a railway line called the Sunshine Coast Line. But despite its name, it doesn't actually run through any of the major urbanised parts of the Sunshine Coast. Rather, the line stops at various small inland towns, the reason for this being that this railway line was built well before the Sunshine Coast had grown into what it is today, and at the time the various population centres were all more inland. This means, however, that if you do want to use this railway line to get to the coast, well, you'll need to make a transfer to a bus. And this makes journeys from Brisbane by public transport significantly slower than journeys made by car. But the new train line aims to change that. The plan for the first phase of the line is to branch off the current Sunshine Coast railway line after the existing Beerwah station, before running 19 kilometres to a new station at Caloundra on the southern edge of the Sunshine Coast's urban area, with an intermediate stop at another new station at Nirimba. This first phase is expected to massively cut the travel time between the Sunshine Coast and Brisbane, with journeys made using the new train line estimated to be up to 45 minutes faster than driving during peak hours. This will be helped by the fact that parts of the track will be capable of allowing trains to reach speeds of up to 160 km an hour, although the actual existing trains can only get to 140 km an hour, which is in fairness still pretty good and a fair bit faster than driving on the motorway. Now, Phase 1 has been estimated to cost between $5 and $7 billion, and I do have to say that seems a little steep. Sure, it is 19 kilometers long, but it's almost all through undeveloped land, and only has 2 stations. In contrast, Perth's Yanchep rail extension, which is set to open in just a couple of months, has been able to add 3 new stations along 14 kilometers of new track for just over $1 billion, which does seem a bit more reasonable. That said, the goal for this phase of the line is to have it open in time for the 2032 Brisbane Summer Olympics. But the plan isn't to stop there. Phase 1 of the line really just grazes the southern edge of the urban area and doesn't really reach the heart of the Sunshine Coast, with passengers travelling there by train still needing to change for a bus or even car if they want to travel to anywhere in the urban area that isn't covered by the 2 stations of Phase 1. But Phases 2 and 3 aim to fix that. In Phase 2 the line will be extended north, with new stations at Aruna and Bertinia. Then Stage 3 will extend it north again, by a further 2 stations, the first at Mountain Creek and then finally at Maroochydore, which will bring the full length of the line to 37 kilometers and brings us to the extent of the plans announced for the line. When these final 2 phases of the line are complete, fewer passengers will be needing to change for long bus rides, as the line will run most of the way through the coast's urban area. But on top of that, it will also start to act as a sort of local rail service for the Sunshine Coast, by providing a simple north-south link across the 6 stations sitting within its urban area. Australian intercity rail networks often end up serving a hybrid role, where their aim is to both connect secondary cities with their state capitals and to provide local service within those secondary cities. The Central Coast Line in New South Wales is a great example of this, where the line functions to connect the Central Coast and Newcastle with Sydney, and also to provide a service that allows Central Coast residents to make shorter journeys within the coast. The same is true for the lines from Melbourne to Geelong, Sydney to Wollongong, and even Brisbane to the Gold Coast, to name a few. And it looks like the same will be true for the Sunshine Coast as well. This local service could be complemented even further by a potential Sunshine Coast Light Rail line, but that project hasn't been confirmed yet. That said, Phases 2 and 3 are still quite a ways off. They don't have a timeline set yet, and they have not received any funding, so we can't know when and even if they will actually get built. In my view, it is pretty critical that they do. As I mentioned before, Phase 1 of the line just sort of grazes the southern edge of the urban area, and it won't be all that useful until it's able to serve the majority of the urban area without requiring travellers to change for overly long buses. So I think these future extensions should be made a priority. Another factor that could limit the success of the line is the generally pretty terrible urbanism in this part of Queensland, where the focus has been on low-density urban sprawl and car-based infrastructure. Now, this can be solved with a network of high-quality feeder bus services. Perth's Mandurah and Butler lines have shown how rail can be successful in low-density suburbs if the bus network connecting to it is good enough. But this is made particularly challenging by the use of artificial canals in places like the Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast, which make it difficult to run simple and direct bus routes, and leads to curvy and inefficient routes like this one from the Gold Coast. The bus network in the Sunshine Coast is pretty lacking generally. It's no surprise the region apparently has the second highest rates of car ownership in Australia. So plans will be needed to improve it in time for the opening of Phase 1. That said, there are at least some other plans to help the potential success of the new line. To get people to ride it, the Queensland government is planning on constructing a significant amount of new housing near the new stations, although it's unclear yet if this will just be more low-density urban sprawl, or the actual medium or high-density housing the line will need to be properly successful. Ultimately though, this project will bring some much-needed improvements to the transportation options for the currently very underserved Sunshine Coast region. But for it to reach its full potential, the project can't exist in a vacuum. Phases 2 and 3 do need to be built so the line can actually serve a substantial part of the urban area. Better buses will be needed to allow people who don't live right by the line to get to it easily. And more housing will be needed to ensure the land around the new stations is used to its best potential. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any thoughts about this new line, leave a comment below. I'd be interested to hear them. Of course, if you did like the video, consider giving it a like and subscribing if you haven't already. I'm City Moose, and as always, thanks for watching.